Hello and welcome to the second day of the 11th Experimental Curators Hub 2021. Yesterday's opening conversation between the Director of Brokers Bao, Stephanie Rosenthal, and artist Grace and Ritu marked a meditative immersion connecting us all together in this digital platform, raising some really crucial ideas that made us introspect. Today, we return with excitement to the hub with our friends from Australia. It's late in the night there, so thank you very much for joining us so late and accommodating our time. Welcome Mikala Tai, Curator and Director of Australia Council for the Arts, and Mark Goldenfein, creative entrepreneur and tech disruptor, if I may call you that. They'll talk about a renewed way to look at arts funding and possibly make a proposition for structural change in many ways, and I can't wait to take this opportunity to thank our partners, Australian High Commission Kolkata, the Girl Institute Kolkata, Take on Art Magazine and Art Review. Our special thanks to Natasha Jindwala to moderate the Curators Hub and holding the strings of it so closely together. Thank you, Natasha.
I just wanted to reach out to our members in the audience, both in the Zoom room and on YouTube, on Art Review's platform or Facebook. Please feel free to share your questions and make your voice heard. The hub was always designed for fearless conversation and exchange, and your participation makes it all the more special. So please do feel free to raise your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the conversation. Natasha and Mark and Mikala possibly at the end, but feel free to ask at any time. And with that, I hand over to Natasha for today.
Welcome to day 2 of the Experimental Curators Hub. I wanted to reflect briefly on our first day, and for those of you who joined and also those of you who are coming in freshly today. Firstly, there is a statement that has been written on the Experimental Curators Hub blog entry for day 1 by Mario, who has also interviewed our participants for this edition. A notion that did come up is the idea of hospitality and what does it mean to generate modes of hospitality as part of institution building and the institution's reach within a time of intensive precarity around the world, and one that is unevenly distributed. So how do we think about hospitality arising in response to a call we did not expect? It is more a matter of visitation than invitation, as has been written in philosophy, whether it is Derrida or others, more than really thinking of hospitality as an unwelcome interruption, thinking of it as beyond a planned moment or association, thinking of it as an excess, wherein the language of participation may even be ways of making together. And I'm also saying this with regard to our guests today and the way that they have been working. What does it mean to anticipate that hospitality involves risk, or at least the willingness to put oneself at risk, to learn from below? So learning to learn from below, and in this case, I'm thinking of Spivak and saying not only what does it mean to put a ear to the ground, but rather actually also not even imagine that this is a process that we already know, but rather to have the humility, to have the sense of accountability and exposure that comes with real learning to learn from below, which includes the muddiness of knowledge that is inscribed and porous at once. The curatorial then as both making kin and making trouble. To create meshworks and instruments of sensing polyphonous relationality. Infrastructures, as we will address today, in a time of epic collapse and mass failures of network systems. how not to move into an autopilot mode, but rather to relearn how to attend to emergent realities. We know that the attention economy, and particularly our sort of fatigue around virtual processes, whether it is something like the Hub or even something like as large as the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, what does it mean to seek attention today? What are we asking? What are we holding together without extractivism of that very attention from body, mind? And one of the images that came through the news that many of you must have seen in this regard is also what kind of images are we producing for the kind of urgencies that are at hand. And one such, particularly from the climate conference, was Tuvalu's foreign minister, Simon Coffey, standing in this as the sea waters are rising with his lectern in the waters. And I felt there was something about that moment that really was this kind of urgent call, which was not about, you know, a 2050 deadline, but really what are we willing to do with an immediacy. So I wanted to kind of usher that image in as we start for the day. And with great pleasure, I now introduce our guest, Nicola Tai, who is Head of Visual Arts, Australia Council for the Arts, as Pratik has already shared. But prior to this, she's been director of the extremely important arts organization 4A, Center for Contemporary Art in Sydney. We have also had participants from 4A before, and it really has a strong resonance for us in the region. So we welcome this generous perspective. Nicola has been curator and researcher and academic, specializing in contemporary Asian art, collaborating at local levels, but also with international organizations to strengthen their ties between Australia and Asia. She has taught at various academies, including the Monash University, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and her writing appears in various periodicals and catalogs. Her peer collaborator, I hear they know each other for over a decade. Mark Goldenstein is a creative entrepreneur and the co-founder of Artstart, which is a new initiative attempting to build a sustainable funding source for the arts, powered by transaction payments, fees. He has deep experience in event technology, payments, partnerships, and digital media, and is compassionate about creative collaborative solutions for supporting independent artists on the one hand, but also small arts organizations. So we're keenly listening to the strategies that you're building together and also individually. And Mark has held senior roles at media companies in Australia and the United States, where he oversaw strategy, editorial, and community building. And he also sits on the board of aphids, which is a 27-year-old experimental arts organization, which we might also hear a little bit about today. Welcome, and the session is yours.
Thanks, Natasha. Thank you to everyone from Experimenta for having us. And just before we start, on behalf of both Mark and myself, we wish to acknowledge that we're both calling in tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are, from the Gadigal land, the Eora Nation, which is otherwise known as Sydney, Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We are lucky enough to live, work, and play on this land, and to come to join you tonight from this space. We'd also like to extend our acknowledgement and our respect to all the First Nations peoples of whose lands you're all calling in from around the world today. We're going to talk as fast as we can about our histories tonight. To give a little bit of a background as to why we're working where we are now and why we are grappling with some of the questions that we wish to pose both to you, but we're also constantly posing to ourselves. We're really interested in structural change. How do you build change? What do you need to do that? How do you build something that's long lasting? How do you respect what's come before while also thinking about the futures? And we're really interested about expanding this conversation from our local perspective and our regional sort of understanding into a really truly global conversation. We think this is a bigger problem than what we are looking at just in front of us, and we're hoping that you can share that tonight. Mark, anything you want to add before we start?
Let's start. Thanks so much, Michaela, for doing introductions. And yeah, super keen to hear a global perspective, and yeah, very excited for tonight. Thanks so much.
So what we're going to start off with, I'm just going to do a really quick run through about my past history and sort of my curatorial work, just so you can get an idea of why I'm moonlighting as a bureaucrat at the moment, and then Mark's going to do the same for his histories as well. But I had a pretty standard art historical background. I trained at University of Melbourne, and while I was doing my undergraduate, I also worked at the largest state gallery, biggest gallery, contemporary art, but also historical collecting space in Melbourne, in Australia, called the National Gallery of Victoria. And I was there for quite a long time. I was there for so long that when I was 25, I got long service leave, which is never a good sign. But it was a great experience. I worked in every single aspect of the organisation, from prints and drawings to front desk to programming, to assisting with some curatorial work. And it really gave me an idea of how these big structures and the role of the institution and the power of the institution. And through both these things happening concurrently at the NGV and also University of Melbourne, I was really aware about what I wasn't seeing and what I wasn't learning about. I'd grown up in Hong Kong. I'm half Chinese, and there was a whole series of stories that were missing from the canon that I was being taught. So that was where my first sort of questioning started about what we think of as about our shared ideas of art and culture and what we should be thinking about. And so I sort of began asking myself a series of questions at that point. And that was amplified by working Parasite, which is a small artist-run, was an artist-run space. It's now professionalized and is really important small organization in Hong Kong. And I worked there every summer for quite a long period, and was able to sort of work with Tobias Berger, Christina Lee, and be part of that thinking about the role of Asia in the future of global art history, and thinking about that kind of placement. So it was a really interesting sort of beginning. Next slide, please, Mark. After I decided I needed to leave the NGV after turning 25 and sort of being told to go on holiday, I decided just to do a whole lot of things. And I spent a long period while I was doing my PhD taking all sorts of jobs. It's my season of yes, I call it. I worked and I helped start a co-working space, which enabled me to write from a desk with other people, so I wasn't just at home being lonely, but also to interact with people who are working in really different realms, and people that were starting up floristry delivery services, which are now everywhere. People who are starting up new HR think tanks about how we work. I was there when Etsy first launched in Australia. All those kinds of things were housed in this co-working space. I also started to work in fashion, where I was sort of producing all sorts of events, from offsite runways to thinking about how fashion and image making works and the power of the images and how that becomes a real commodifier, and how artists, fashion designers as artists were making a living that artists that I was been living and working and breathing until that point were not, and really thinking about how the sort of structures around fashion had built in a completely different way to sort of the visual arts. And that led me at one point to then do a startup for myself, which was called Supergraph, which kind of reflected on all these things. It was huge, actually. It took over the whole of the Royal Exhibition Building in Melbourne, pop-up art fair that looked at graphic art. And I was really spurred to do this because all of my friends were really interested in art, kind of were starting to get money, we're getting new houses, and they all kept on buying their art from IKEA, and it was really frustrating me. They were particularly buying this really large stretched canvas, not even canvas, I think it was like a plastic thing, of the Flatiron Building in New York. And I was like, this has to be something else. So the idea behind Supergraph was to sort of meet that audience with artists and graphic designers who were unable to derive their full income from their work. All our graphic designers doing annual reports. They wanted to do their own creative output. And so that worked on that for a few years before I sold that business. Next slide. And then throughout this period, I was working with a series of artists. I was moving between my research, which was on China, between Asia and Australia, with also particular interests in Indonesia and Pakistan. And so throughout this period and into my time at 4A, I worked with a series of artists and became really inspired by those that were really thinking about new ways and finding new visual languages to talk about the world that we were in, and challenging what had come before and what was coming next. So Indonesia's Eko Nugroho brought this particular work to Australia, and it's now in the collection of the NGV. Abdullah M.I. Sayed, who is Pakistani-Australian artist who does these fabulous works that really kind of question political power and the way that money is all kind of paving the way and opening all the doors, socio-economic doors. Yang Yung Liang, who's an artist that he and I became fast friends in Shanghai in one hot summer, and sort of put our money on each other and took a lot of risks and did some shows together early on, and he's now sort of super famous. I'm lucky just to be around his glow. And then artists such as Adila Sulman and Georgina Q, who come from, as sort of shot is great. It's in Singapore, brings together Pakistani artists and Australian artists who have never met, but their work's in conversation about what you can see and what you can't see and what's hidden. So it's been really interesting to work with these artists who, for me, have been able to really give a perspective onto the world that I think is so valuable and really needs to be heard. And one of the frustrations throughout this whole period was the fact that I didn't think that artists were finding the audiences that they deserved, and which really led me then to sort of be like, I need to take a proper job, make my parents happy, and started to work at 4A, which I think is the next slide. Yes. So the image of the building is the one in the middle, and 4A is a fantastic organization. I will never have a better job than director of 4A. The audiences is fantastic. The artists that work and trust you are amazing. And the board is so great. And it's small enough that it's scrappy, but it's ambitious and it's nimble and it can work really, really fast. And the work that we were able to do there was sort of from working with really luminous greats like Lee Kuan Yew, who's an underrated modernist master, and have him come to Australia and create works in front of us, this in our small space that was at 4A, but sort of big ideas, to working with the Umbrella Movement Visual Art Archive Research Collective from Hong Kong to bring things that had been saved from the protests in 2014 off the street and to give them a new life in Sydney, and to really think about what that kind of protest was about and what it means for the future. To even talk series, this is a symposium called Where South is North, which looked at Australia's relationship with the wider South Asia community, and how there's so much embedded within contemporary Australian culture that is really indebted to the migration and the great creative thinking of these communities. And the work there at 4A was vast and it was really big. And I think there's one more slide, 4A, I think. I got to work with sort of artists that are doing really, really amazing things, like Xiao Lu, who's, a really important performance artist from China, and her work to be able to commission and produce a really significant performance piece was sort of a life-changing moment for me. And also working with Hahan, who dares to sort of hack the art world and refuses to sell his, very expensive and fantastic works at an art fair, but instead sell things for $20 or $40 or $50 by cutting up a painting live. And I was just really interested in all these artists and how they were really pushing how we think about the future and how we think about our own industry as well. But throughout that period, it was becoming really clear that our audience was great, but our audience could only go so far. And the thinking that happens and the kind of creative problem solving, it has so many bigger applications. So I started to really think about what that could be. I think on to you now, Mark. Yes.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Michaela. I just wanted to give everyone a background into my history and kind of how I've landed where I am now. Sort of an unwieldy story, but it all makes sense in the end. I started my career as an independent filmmaker. I was a producer and director trying to make things and make ends meet all at the same time. I did that for about 10 years to varying degrees of success, but ultimately I left the film industry because it was very difficult to make a living. And so I jumped ship thinking that online media was going to be this new space where creativity would flourish, where you could make things and monetize them and have kind of a new career. Unbeknownst to me that space was already about to be disrupted by major social media companies, and that it was going to be harder and harder to pay for journalists. So I was an editor for a number of years, and journalism was getting harder and harder to fund, and it was quite a distressing time. And so I left online media and created sort of an e-commerce business. Really, the goal was to fund interesting writing, interesting journalism, funded through subscriptions rather than through online advertising. This is pre-Substack and all those types of platforms, but we sort of tried to come up with a subscription model that was, that was conducive to creating an audience and monetizing it in an effective way that didn't force you to create clickbait and other things that I was forced to do while I was working in online media. That project was based out of New York. It was called Subscription. It was a lot of fun, but I moved on from that and I moved more into straight technology. I worked for a company in Australia called Try Booking, which is essentially the largest independent ticketing platform, which would connect. It's really a tool set for anyone to create events and sell tickets. And we had thousands and thousands of people using the platform. And it was a really exciting time scaling that business. And that is essentially where I learned about payments. So, when someone buys a ticket, the money flows through our system and ends up in the pocket of the event organizer, minus their fees. I learned a lot about payments infrastructure and how much money is in it, and how hidden it is, and how accepted it is as a sort of necessary infrastructure. It was a great time at Try Booking. I got a lot of learnings out of it, and then I was also on the board. I'm currently still on the board of aphids, which is, as mentioned before, a 27-year-old experimental arts organisation. A brilliant organisation. It's very successful, doing incredible work all over Australia and the world, run by 3 wonderful women. That project, Easy Riders, by Eugenia Lim, was cancelled a number of times during COVID. They finally got to do the project, and it was a great success. I couldn't see the project because I was in lockdown in another state, unfortunately. But I guess in this role, I got a little bit behind the scenes to understand really how arts organisations, independent arts organisations run, how they survive, the difficulty in how difficult it is. It was a really interesting time for me, and still is an interesting time for me to work out how these organisations need to keep the lights on and how we fund them, essentially. I think this is a good time to talk about where me and Michaela crossed over. We met, it says my internet's unstable. We met at a digital agency called Portable Studios, and we sort of worked on lots of big problems. We failed a lot, and we sort of formed a pretty incredible friendship. What do you think about this time, Michaela?
Yeah, I think Portable was a really important time for me. I was there. I just been producing and starting an event called the Fashion Film Series, which was a series of sort of like a festival for fashion filmmakers who are making really short films when they were commissioned by fashion designers. And we're working with Portable to distribute and make sure that these things could be seen as art as opposed to just sort of like an avenue for retail. So Portable was this amazing place to think about how tech could intersect with things. We worked on health problems, we worked on sort of retail issues, but just to try and think about what solutions could there be, where are the intersections, and the team at Portable were all deeply embedded within the arts, across all arts and culture, as well as sort of the whole myriad of things. But it was a really, really great place to really nurture an appetite for risk. And we saw so many failures. We were part of so many failures.
Yeah.
And
ultimately, great things.
Yeah, so many great things. Portable still exists today. But it enabled me to start thinking through ideas of how sometimes the solutions may come from outside the arts industry and not just from within, and how could we pinpoint where that moment is.
Cool. This is a section we call ongoing frustrations, and I didn't know what image to put on the right for Michaela, so I just left it blank so she could kind of project her frustration in that space.
You can draw your own frustration in this box. But basically, I think this is a really important part. I think if we're going to talk about the fact this is coming from a curatorial place, my curatorial methodologies, and I think this really speaks to the image that Natasha talked about. So you can just see it in front of you, that lapping water with someone trying to make this formal speech, and that being the biggest statement that can be about how do we create images, or how do we enable this thinking to intersect at the right moments for that impact. And a lot of the work and the artists that I continue to be honoured enough and lucky enough to work with their generosity, they're really asking these questions and pushing things. However, we're finding, and I continue to find, that the audiences only reach so far when they should be so much bigger. So I started to ask myself, are there limits to what you can do as a curator with these big issues? Like, can art change the world? And I used to be a fervent believer in that, and I've come to sort of move away from that. I believe that art can really impact and challenge how we debate and how we think and how we put pressure on those that have power. But in terms of actually changing the infrastructure, that comes from somewhere else. So how do we influence that? And this was sort of even more affected for me by COVID. There was a moment, I think probably almost 18 months ago, when COVID had happened. Everyone was in this new state of pause, but also the inequities were really visible. Black Lives Matters was occurring, but there was so many discussions, and they were coming right to the surface. And there was a moment when I believed, and I think a few others did, that the world would not go back to what it was before. And I think in the past year, it's become really clear that the majority of people want to revert to the status quo, and the structure hasn't changed and the systems have not moved. And we went through all of this, and still, the large majority of Africa is not vaccinated, and we're talking about opening up and people going on holidays. But how do we talk about this, and how do we what role does art have within that? So for the first time, I actually entertained the idea of coming to work at a bureaucracy and to work within policy, and thinking about how can I bring my curatorial understanding, but also my friendships with artists that have trusted me with their thinking, into an organisation such as Australia Council, to think about how I could have even a small effect on how infrastructure is built in an ongoing manner. So as part of my work at Australia Council, I get to work with a wonderful team who delivers the Australia Pavilion at Venice, the most high profile sort of moment for really thinking about artistic thinking and problem solving. But also we work to create the policies and the investment frameworks that support the wider industry here.
So these, let's call these my personal frustrations. But really, my frustrations were galvanized in 2020 when there was around 50 small arts organizations got defunded. It was personally just a really tough time thinking about all these incredible people who were going to be scaled back, orgs that were going to get scaled back. It's just sad, I think, knowing that orgs had scaled up and then we're going to be forced to scale back. And I guess my other frustrations were that a lot of, in Australia particularly, a lot of arts orgs only can survive on government funding. That philanthropy is quite hard to access. The top end of town can access philanthropy. They've got teams, they know what to do, whereas small arts orgs don't necessarily have that expertise. And then not really personal frustrations around COVID closures. You can't be frustrated about COVID. That's a bit useless. But I think it just laid bare how fragile the arts industry was, and just the fragility was laid bare. It was a tough time. And me personally, I got made part-time. I was working full-time. I got made part-time in this period. And I probably sooked and was upset for a week, but after that, I thought to myself, I'm going to do something rather than just watch Netflix on the couch. I'm going to try and do something with my experience to help support the arts. And so essentially, I spent the last year or so working on a new project, a new initiative called Artspay. It's a payment processor, which essentially means, when you purchase something in a store with a credit card, or you buy something online with a card, the merchants need payment processors to transfer the money from the customer into their bank account. There's a complex system that does that. And it's, Artspay's mission is to support the arts, not just, exist purely for profit. We have a foundation that is the majority shareholder of the company, Artspay, and really our remit is to try and fill gaps in the funding landscape in Australia and hopefully globally soon. We have an incredible team, and we're actually out in the world transacting at the moment. We have payments happening all over the country, and organisations are jumping on board, which is really exciting. Just give you a little bit of understanding about why I chose payments. I had that experience in my past where I learned a little about payments, and payments is actually, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. It's not a small industry. It touches everything. And it's essentially embedded into the capitalist structure. Every time you have a consumer and you want to take a payment, there's a payment processor in the background taking fees. And so Artspay, essentially, we talked about a little bit as like a bit of a structural intervention. My goal is to go and take some of those payments fees that are going to large banks or to Silicon Valley giants and redistribute them back into the arts ecosystem through grants and through fellowships and through all types of grant-making programs. We've got to get some of that money back. And what's exciting for me is that now with this structure, any business can support the arts. It doesn't all have to be government or philanthropy. If you own a shop that sells flowers and you take payments and you're interested in supporting the arts, you switch your payments processor, and fees will be going to Artspay and then the Artspay Foundation. And it's like not just a one-off donation, it's actually like ongoing fees every single day. And it's we're hoping that we can keep those fees flowing, for the life of the business. And it's exciting because really, it's a huge market, it's a huge opportunity. Knowing that any business can switch over if they're inclined. And usually when we speak to business owners who have that sort of interest in the arts and supporting the arts and their arts aligned, we're hearing that it's a no-brainer for them to switch, and it's giving us lots of confidence that this idea has got some resonance and can be successful. We received a grant, and that's why I'm working with Michaela. We received a grant from the Australia Council to essentially do a research project and consult with artists, with peak bodies, with industry leaders about how to deploy this funding in an interesting, unique, and effective way. We also know that the foundation is going to be artist-led. My co-founder, Lara Toms, she's an artist, she is an arts advocate, and she's ensuring that artists are actually at the centre of all of our decision-making. And, you know, she really is a brilliant thinker and is constantly pushing me to think about how we can position the business to do more for the arts in every facet. Really, we're trying to help fill the gaps in arts funding. We're not trying to replace the Australia Council. We're trying to, you know, work in a way that is different and can be effective in another way. So I thought we might just talk a little bit about the funding gaps, and then we've got some questions after this to talk, because we really want to understand where the funding gaps are globally. So yeah, Michaela, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and we were trying to think about what imagery we could use to do this, and we just couldn't think of anything. So we got circles. And I think that actually is really great, because in Australia, and this is particular to our environment, the government is a really large supporter of arts and culture, which is fabulous. But what that does mean is that artists and organisations have to adhere to larger government priorities, goals, initiatives, and all these kinds of things, which means that, you know, as politicians move and as the tides of sort of favour move, that it's always, those goalposts are always moving. And then so you've got that as sort of like one aspect. There's then philanthropic funding that comes through in a much more uneven manner, because you know, personal people or foundations have got specific goals that they are also trying to get. And then also with that, you've got the market that is, you know, buying the tickets to your show, buying your artwork, all these kinds of things. So it's kind of like this very sophisticated but kind of Frankenstein built structure that is also precarious. And the precarity of this became so clear over the last 18 months, and the gaps, and the fact that, for example, so many artists and even those that work within professional roles within the arts are casualised. They choose to be freelancers, meant that they were unable to get sort of further COVID support in Australia anyway. So it became clear that the structure is not really supporting what the artists need. And also fundamentally, in all of these organisations, there's no artists thinking through the problems. There are people like myself as a bureaucrat now, but there's no one that the sector is always at beyond these organisations and not within them. So how could we envisage, and I think Mark and the team at ArtsPay are really trying to think about, how do you build something if you can build it from scratch? And when we got the invitation from the team at Experimented to be part of this talk, it's like, well, we're struggling with this question now, because we always talk about it, but now Mark's had this fabulous idea and built this foundation that has the ability to do it. How do we fill the gaps? So yeah, this is a perfect segue slide.
So we've started our research, and we've been doing interviews. My partners, Al Webster and Lara Toms, they are deep in research and consultation in conjunction with Dr. Amy Spears from RMIT in Melbourne. What we know, this is the things that we're hearing, is that there's enough project funding in the Australian landscape, and that what's really desperately needed is operational funding, core funding, things like fellowships, because they're not attached to projects where most of the money goes out. You know, once you finish a project, you'll look and see that, you know, you've spent most of the money. Things like keeping the lights on, and yeah, grants that are easy to apply for, obviously easy to acquit, but yeah, things that are really about keeping people in the arts industry. And you know, yeah, I think that's the main thing that we're hearing.
Yeah, sorry, Mark. I guess on a global scale also, we're just trying to figure out, how do the structures work elsewhere? We know that in other countries and other places, the government support is nowhere near, or it's not at all. And in that case, how could you build a structure that does give that kind of underlying support that isn't, you know, we're lucky enough to get here in Australia? So there's a whole lot of questions that are coming through.
Yeah, and honestly, this is the time for chats If you've got questions, you've got ideas, we would love to hear them. So throw them in the chat, because it would be very exciting to have this as an open dialogue. So yeah, Michaela, what are the gaps in the current arts funding landscape?
There's so many gaps. I think we've been looking a lot, and I think the discussion with Mark, even long before ArtsPay began, and then now, this sort of presentation is kind of the most formal version of these chats we've been having over coffee for a long period. It's got a bit more serious in the last year when the idea of ArtsPay kind of began, and especially so when Australia Council support became aligned to the project. But in terms of gaps in the current landscape, we're looking at how do artists, when do artists need the impact, the support the most? When can we, be really strategic about ensuring that there's a continued culture of being able to create? And we're finding moments that are really critical, such as when people first finish sort of formal education in the arts and are sort of unleashed into the world for the first time as an artist. We're also finding that they can come from a non-sort of formal background, but how do you get that first start and get the tools to set yourself up as a small business, and then to sort of build the structures that you need to continue? And then also for artists that are older and have been working for a while but have always had a second job, how do you then balance things when life gets more complicated and you've got quite a lot of responsibilities beyond yourself and you need to sort of have constant and income, which then sort of goes into barriers to access funding, which is, writing grants. Number one, knowing that grants exist is a big barrier. Knowing that you can apply, believing that you can apply is another barrier. Number two is, how do you apply? How do you write? What do the people want to hear? Every single grant is assessed by different people in a different process. So you're constantly, as an applicant, learning how to do this again. I'm sure, Mark, have you got similar feedback?
On accessibility?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's really interesting things being done at the moment. Things like no application grants, that, putting one line in as the application to make it more accessible and easy to access. Yeah, I'm really interested in ways of making it easy, trusting artists as well to perform and do what they do best. We've got a couple of questions we've got one question coming through. Maybe we can answer them. Okay, what do you think?
Let's do it.
Anonymous attendee. The question is, given that hopefully it's going to be a globally acceptable payment solution, once you receive the money, how do you plan to distribute the funds collected with responsibility and spread? For example, in an ideal situation, how does an artist who really needs the funding, say in West Africa, gain from someone who is making payments through the app in Sweden for the service provider who is based in Japan? How will you regulate this? Sure. We're not global yet. Our plan is to be global, and we have the capability of being global. The merchants are based in a location. So if you're a merchant in Australia and you take a payment from overseas, the money still goes through the merchant account in Australia. So that those fees that will be incurred by that merchant in Australia, that will flow to the Australian Foundation. And then in other jurisdictions, it will be around any merchants in those jurisdictions, the fees won't come back to Australia. They'll go to their own arts ecosystem. That's the plan at the moment, but keen to hear if people have ideas about making a more fair and equitable system. The other question here is, are you concerned that this system will give right-wing governments an excuse to further reduce arts funding in Australia? We hope not. That's not been posed to me before. Yeah, Michaela, do you want to jump in?
I thought about this a lot, actually, obviously, because I'm working within government. I think the government, that's the biggest precarity, one of the biggest precarities, other than obviously a pandemic, is that governments and their whims change, and artists are exposed to that risk. And this in some ways is not to replace that, it's just to sit alongside it as another avenue which would buffer the impact from something like that. Because we can never predict what governments will do next, and we can never predict what philanthropists will do next. But something that's artist-centered and decision-making made by the artists, that is a bit more consistent in, doesn't matter what the climate is.
Yeah, we're trying to do something different as well. So we're hoping that the government doesn't see that as an excuse. That would be terrible. We talked about what funding models have had the most impact, and I think actually yesterday Michaela and I started talking about an old program in Australia called Artstart, and how successful that was, and how many people we knew actually received Artstart, and how they gave them such a leg up. Michaela, do you want to talk about that for one moment?
Yeah, I think there's an important aspect to funding that we don't always think of. Yes, it's financial and it helps you bring projects to life, but also it's confidence. It really enables you to have a sense of recognition in the work that you're doing, and an understanding that it is impactful for not just yourself, but for an audience and a community. And that is really critical at an early stage of a career. When you have moved out of sort of the situation where you're sharing a studio or working in doing plays in a much larger space, to have that kind of recognition and safety net is really, really huge. So Artstart was really aimed at that. And there's a whole lot of good funding models that have been and gone, and they've gone for, variety of reasons. But we're also really keen to hear about whether there's some models that you think are just the best, that have really impacted or had great effect on community that we could perhaps look at as ideas of how the foundation's being built.
Yeah, if you've got examples of great innovative models, especially overseas, where we'd love to hear about them. The next question. This is another one that we'd love to open to the floor as well. How do you think we should deliver support to independent artists and arts organisations? We've got a clean slate at ArtsPay. It's really exciting, and the consultation is in progress. And it would be good to understand how people think that funding should be delivered. Michaela, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, just reading the questions. I think there's so many different ways that we could do it. Like, I think Mark was just, before we came on, we were talking about, do artists really need the money in one big lump sum? Should it be coming like a wage and be sort of coming monthly or fortnightly? What actually helps people build their work
and enable
them? Yeah.
Do you want to have a go at this question? I think there's a gap of funding for art mediation.
Yeah, I think cultural mediation, art mediation is a growing area. Like, when I think back to when I was, on the front desk of National Gallery, my main job was pointing people where the toilets were. And that was kind of seen as the audience engagement and customer service. So that's gone, it's a whole different world now. And the kind of support and the sort of active need for institutions, I think we spoke about that yesterday, to go to audiences and reflect their audiences in a much more holistic way, requires time, and it requires investment in audiences and in the people that can do it. So that definitely, I think, in terms of what needs to be funded, would be something that should be on the table for the foundation.
Cool. One last question for you, Michaela. What point in an artist's career do they need support?
I think I kind of jumped the gun. I think it's, all the time artists need support, and I think at different times for each individual artist. So I think it's really what the foundation's tussling with, and which we'd love to hear from people today, is about how do you create something that enables artists to recognize that moment themselves? This is the moment I need to go for that or apply for that. And how do we build a structure that is ready for that ask when it comes in?
Wonderful. Hopefully people got ideas. I think that's all the questions we wanted to pose. I can go back and bring them up again if people want to see them, but maybe just like to say thanks so much for having us. Michaela, you are amazing, and it's wonderful to work with you and get your support on this project. And I was so flattered when you asked me to come on as a co-thinker, and yeah, thanks so much.
No, anytime, Mark. I think it's just great, I think, to have, and I think Experimenter to really encourage thinking from outside the arts, I think is really important to our entire industry to be sort of able to sort of engage in that manner. Natasha.
Thank you so much. So I think if we can stop sharing screen, we can also see you and focus on both of you, so that we can also combine the questions from the audience and a few more that came to my mind while listening to you closely. And one is from one of our audience members, which also connects to something I wanted to check with you. Mukesh asks, there seems to be a disparity between receiving funds for modern popular art forms as opposed to traditional folk indigenous art forms, and there's also a struggle to evolve and innovate with certain more sort of traditional arts and those vocabularies. So how do we tackle this? And I really feel also that it's quite, I'm sure you've thought about this, but also what does it mean for indigenous makers and remote communities to actually access this certain kind of digital financialization that we all know is also part of a certain kind of neoliberal cultural circuit, which we do need to be critical of in certain ways. So I'd love to understand how you're thinking about that.
We are consulting with Indigenous artists and Indigenous organisations, arts organisations, and we're very conscious of making the grants accessible and easy to access. So we're working on this report, and that will include a lot of their insights, and we're hoping to make sure that First Nations are recipients of these grants. First Nation peoples are recipients of these grants because we want to have as much impact as we can.
I mean, fundamentally, from an Australian perspective, First Nations art and culture is our guiding foundational culture. It is what we are lucky enough to be joining and part of. So it's been really great to see so many organisations that are based within First Nations be interested and also sign up to Arts Pay, and to be real champions for the program, and to see the fact that this will have a massive flow-on effect. The sort of development of the Indigenous art market has been really fast during COVID. I think the switch to online has been mammoth. And to be able to support that further and support all the new initiatives that can enable greater access to storytelling, to the sharing of cultural knowledge and insight and guidance is just sort of a great opportunity for the foundation.
Great, thank you for that. I also wonder, what do you all both think in terms of the ways in which the art economy is moving in relation to something like the NFTs? I mean, that's something that it's a topic that stirs emotion, and it questions on one hand access, but also expertise, and also sort of breaks certain hierarchies. But then again, it also puts us again in the kind of class of a certain kind of financial system that has a lot also to do with escalation, and then a kind of a spiral down of interest in artists who may have spent decades building their professional lives and networks of ethics and affect.
You want to go, Kayla?
I can start. My answer is that as soon as I think I figure out what an NFT is, I then get confused again. And I think that in terms of the accessible and the understanding and who is it for, it's so removed, I think, from the normal engagement with arts and culture at this moment, that I think it's in some ways at the opposite end of the spectrum as to what this foundation is looking to do. But it illustrates kind of the entrepreneurship of this kind of new digital space and this new ways of engaging, and how arts and culture will work as it has always done in all aspects of it. But I'm just happy to be working in a sort of supporting a foundation model in this moment that does come back to how, putting that money back with artists.
I think that it's a tool like NFTs that platformize your work, but the platforms are ultimately the beneficiaries. OpenSea, is turning over billions and billions of dollars, and whilst the artists are making a living, only the top tier are probably really making a financial, really doing well financially, whereas the platforms are still the ultimate beneficiaries, I've got to say. Whereas what we're trying to do with ArtSpay is not just be a tool, but actually be a structural intervention and say, the platform is going to give back to the ecosystem, not just be a tool for you to make money. That's what we're trying to do. And I think that there are some really interesting things happening in Web 3.0. I'm really interested in ArtSpay being involved and being part of Web 3.0 in the future. ArtSpay is a brand, essentially, and we can do something in these spaces, but it's all got to be in service of the foundation. The foundation has got to be the core of what we're trying to do. And if we can make money for the foundation, then we'll do it. That's got to be the driving force.
I think, Natasha, I just want to add to that a little bit, is that one of the things that Mark and both Alistair and Lara always talk about when they talk about ArtSpay is the fact that they're kind of hacking an invisible system, an invisible structure that we're all in the web of. Whether we realize it or not, we each day our money is being tapped and taken to these places. And I think that sort of insidious nature of these invisible structures is a bigger metaphor for kind of what's happening globally, and the fact that in a small way it can be redirected kind of feels like a win. And I'm really interested to think about how many of these invisible structures are there that can be changed or can be tweaked, that stop them being sort of so blatantly money sort of profit driven to being something else. So it's an interesting sort of beginning of this conversation.
Yeah.
Great. There's also a question, if you could maybe go a little bit more into the pragmatics of the current ArtSpay setup. How does an artist connect with ArtSpay, and how to help get the word out?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thanks. Well, we have a website. I'll post it in the chat. artspayfoundation.org. There's just a newsletter capture there, so you can sign up to the newsletter. We'll be talking about our grant rounds and all of our news. That's probably the easiest place to get ongoing information. I'll put that chat in a moment. We'll be announcing grant rounds and things like that through the newsletter. And then just through social media. So yeah, if you want to jump on, I'll just put it in the chat.
And I think it's also probably, we didn't really say, but ArtSpay only launched a few weeks ago. It's officially, Mark and the team have been thinking about it for a while. We've been supporting in the background from Australia Council, but it only was really alive, I think maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. Yeah,
about a month ago. And if you want to support us, you can tell anyone that you know that owns a business that takes payments to check us out and to reach out, because we can help them. The other thing that we're trying to do is lower payments costs for arts organisations. So if arts organisations want to use us as well, we have an incredibly low rate that we want to pass on to arts organisations. That's also part of our mission, to lower the payments costs as well for arts orgs. So that, we can, if you have an organisation and you take payments, please come and talk to me. We'll take care of you and give you a good rate. And then, if you know someone who, doesn't matter if it's hospitality, or if it's retail, it's anything, and they care about the arts, and they care about the industry, they can switch and become part of the community. We're building a community, which is really cool.
I think, yeah, that's a key aspect. I think that ties in with that sort of cultural art mediation question before, is that all these adjacent industries to the arts who are coming on board then have invested interest in seeing where the foundation goes and the artists that come out of it because they're part of it. And I think that kind of direct engagement in the process of giving and supporting will change the sort of all those things we talk about in the arts, about changing how sort of the wider general public think and engage and think about arts being for them. This has the ability to do that.
Okay, great. Also, in terms of your last question of what is it, at what point is it sort of critical for artists to receive support? I mean, I think this is something to go more in depth into, perhaps, because it feels as if, especially international art councils, there's sometimes a discrepancy in terms of how to really accompany the artist through their lifetime. There's such a strange dynamic between, on one, a certain in a certain way wishing to maybe just support the first 2 years of an artist's career after they finish and leave the arts academy, because they are in a sense also users of the system. They will go on residencies, their name will circulate in a certain way. This kind of also gives back to the system, so the kind of arts council or public money sort of. And at the same time, then we know also how the gallery system in a way also operates in terms of supporting senior artists really towards the end of their life. So mid-career artists feel as if suddenly, there's a sense of exhaustion and difficulty in their lives, but they're not receiving support and moments. Artists who are parenting, single parents, or live in setups of family building which are not untraditional. There's so many aspects that are just not worked out and worked through, and we know this. But I really would like to look at specific examples. What is your vision in these aspects?
So I think we want artists to lead this process. So whilst I know what organizations I love and how I would love to deliver the funding, I want to stay out of it as much as possible. We really are listening to artists about how they want the funding to be delivered. And so we're working on this report with the Australia Council to really collect everyone's ideas and have a good sense of the strategy. But we're hearing about fellowships, like you talk about mid-career artists leaving. So things like fellowships, I think, are going to be really important for us. Ongoing support. Maybe it's not even just for 1 year. Maybe it's a 10-year fellowship. These are the types of things that we're starting to think about. Maybe it's monthly payments, like a salary, rather than an upfront grant. They're all really interesting, unique ways of deploying the money. But yeah, at the moment, I want to defer to the report until we have really good strategies and good consultation with artists and arts leaders about where to put the money. I'm excited about that report, and we couldn't have done it without the Australia Council. We really couldn't have done it. We would have probably made some guesses, and now we can really delve in and find out where the gaps are and what to do.
But we're really interested. I'm really fascinated to hear from everyone online today about what support you've received that's been life-changing, and when have you wanted or needed funding and it hasn't been there, or you haven't been able to access something. I always think about that many artists, they have the idea of the big work, their most ambitious idea, it's there. They just haven't got the means, whether that's time, space, money, to actually envisage it. But if they could do that, their career then moves to a different level, that it begins to sort of look after itself. But it's that moment where you need the money to match your ambition that can help your career. So just like that kind of timing stuff is really critical. And also the level of funding, like how much is that? It's endless, probably.
Thank you. Maybe we can let's take this as a prompt. And I know that the Q&A box may not allow for the audience to make those comments. So we can do that in the chat. Just if the audience who is there with us now wants to just put in like a few words about this question. What has it meant for you to also gain support at certain moments, and how is it? What is the absence do, where you might have ideas of what could, in a sense, improve or restructure the system in your context, in your specific context. I mean, we also know that it's an absolute luxury to be based, in many parts of Europe, including Germany, where there was state funding for artists and smaller cultural organizations and businesses during the first sort of lockdowns and time of pandemic. It does not continue. It sort of was more like it's again, how far can this go? This system of distributing funds during such a prolonged time, also when cultural institutions are closed that rely on ticket sales. What does that do then in terms of its reverse effect to artists? So these are all questions that are not easy to understand, but it could be something that we sort of also take up as comments now in the next few minutes, and also just learn from our audiences. I have one more question for you, Nicola. And again, it would be great if you could lead with some examples from your context in terms of also what you envision going forward. How do you want to sort of also think about cultural policy building in relation to the Asia Pacific? I know there are certain ways in which that's happening already in Australia, but also really given your experience, academic as well as directorial in 4A. And I'm particularly interested also in terms of curatorial work and also positioning in terms of really thinking about Indian Ocean relations and how our work can also travel really while thinking through Indian Ocean geographies, because those also break the line of a certain kind of regionalism.
I think Australia still struggles deeply with its geographic positioning as opposed to its historical ties. It's so firmly located within this wider Asian context, and our population reflects that. But if you go into most of our galleries, you still won't find much contemporary Indian art, and very little contemporary Indian Australian art, even though that's a huge part. So there's a lot of work to be done about filling in the gaps that enable the policy to be impactful. We've got a lot of historical background to fill in. There's a lot of misunderstandings that also need to be kind of corrected. And there's also a lot of sort of robust debate that needs to happen as to how and why and when we can draw these sort of curatorial connections and artistic connections. I think residencies, and there's been a huge growth in the last 10, 15 years of Australian artists and artists from the wider Asia coming, the exchange happening. And it's been wonderful to see throughout COVID that this has occurred in digital formats, which is of course different, but it's still enabled this kind of global debate to occur. It's also enabled things to happen that aren't just sort of one-off exchanges between here and there, but are sort of got multiple sites of engagement, which enables bigger conversations to happen. It doesn't just become regional or about exchange or about sort of straight market development, but becomes a sort of think tank of sorts. I think that kind of thinking and the opening of thinking and new ways to sort of structure how that exchange is happening will be key to how then policy is developed. There's already been changes. It's fundamentally Asian cultural literacy is imperative to a contemporary Australia, and that is growing, and there is more investment happening. You can now see in undergraduate courses that you can't escape Asian artists in that sort of thing now. So it's changing, but it's taking time still.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a comment and just acknowledging the difficulty for artists, and especially in the case of South Asia, continuing lockdowns, not only in India, but also the region at large, where there's just a handful of artists who actually have commercial representation. And so artists who are working with experimental practices, who work with local communities and site sort of specific work, it feels really the most hard hit. And it really has become obviously a choice of what does one do to one's artistic kind of makeup. You know, do you at some point, out of sheer hardship, also need to step out of this field? And I think that's the point that we are in. So it's a point of great difficulty in the region. So I mean, I will take this comment, and also with a lot of respect for those who are continuing their practice in these extremely challenging times, and hope that there can be systems that actually do set certain standards in which business is actually willing to do more, that are not looking again for artists in terms of the sort of star artists and continue to keep those hierarchies intact, but rather really acknowledge also the work that it takes to build a cultural ecology. And so whether that's an art mediator or whether that's somebody who's doing other forms of outreach, also get support. So also, again, this is something that is a long way to go, but I do feel that these questions have been raised and thought through in your context. Perhaps if there are other resources you'd like to share, please do, and we can also add them to our chat in the audience, for the audience that comes in tomorrow. And thank you so much for being with us, all of you today, and of course to Michaela Tai and Mark Goldenfein. Tomorrow we are going to be in exchange with Osei Bonsu and artist and DDDK. We're really looking forward to that encounter. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natasha, Michaela, Mark. It was very special. As I said in the comments too, these sessions really allow us to think of alternative models, and the concerns you have for which you've begun this are really concerns for all of us. Thank you for today, and look forward to seeing all of you in the audience tomorrow at the same time.
So I wanted to say that maybe there is a possibility that you both will come to India, and we will have serious actionable steps in rolling it out, in rolling something like Arts Pay Out or Arts Pay Out in our region, because I think there's an option that
top of my list now.
Industries will take up.
Yeah, wonderful.
On that note of hope, thank you and have a good day and good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you.
Good night.